and follow along closely as I read out of the Bible. But I was actually reading Psalm chapter 53, and you guys are reading Psalm chapter 14. Because they are almost identical. There are a few differences, and I think those differences are on purpose. I'm not going to re-preach that whole message, but we will read over this, and I'll give you just a few points. Psalms chapter 53 says, a psalm of David, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Corrupt are they have done abominable iniquity, and there's none that doeth good. God looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand, that did seek God. Every one of them has gone back. They are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Have the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread? They have not called upon God. Now, up to that point, Psalms 14 and Psalms 53 are almost identical. There's a little bit of difference in that Psalms 53 exclusively uses the word God, whereas Psalms 14 uses the word Lord or Jehovah. About the only other difference, other than a couple rearranging of words, is I think the word iniquity is used in Psalms chapter 53, and that word is not used in Psalms 14. But other than that, they're almost identical up to that point. But it does change when it hits verse 5. In verse 5, we see here in Psalms chapter 53 that it says, there were they in great fear, where no fear was, for God hath scattered the bones of him that encampeth against thee. Thou hast put them to shame, because God hath despised them. Whereas in Psalms chapter 14 it says, there were they in great fear, for God is in the generation of the righteous. Ye have shamed the counsel of the poor, because the Lord is his refuge. And there's lots of different, again, I don't want to re-preach this. You do some studying, you read some commentaries. There's all kinds of different opinions about why this verse, this chapter is in here a couple times, and they're all over the board. I figure a couple things. One, I needed it twice. Two, I mentioned that last time that there is, when you actually look at the book of Psalms, we look at the book of Psalms as one book. You go back and you look at Jewish tradition and stuff, and it's actually a couple different volumes. Psalms 14 is in one of them, and Psalms chapter 53 is in a different one. I also think that when you look at it, one of them emphasizes God's deliverance of the righteous, and the other one emphasizes more God's judgment on the wicked. So those are a couple, I think, differences between the two. And again, it's just a great encouragement to go through and to read this and to think through it. We often think about this chapter as, and I'll say this and then I'm going to have to move on or I'm going to preach the message again. We often think about this chapter as the chapter that talks about the atheist, because it says the fool has said in his heart there is no God. There's a couple things I want you to notice. One, it talks about the fact that the fool has said in his heart there is no God, right? And I brought out last time, most atheists I know, and that's not just something they say in their heart, that's something that they proclaim. There is no God. This chapter, I think, incorporates those that may even put on an outward face, but inside, man, they don't really believe there's a God, or they're trying to, they're just not really there, right? So it is more than just tackling the fact that there's atheists in this world. That's one. The other thing I would say is that the verbiage here about the Lord looking down from heaven and seeing that there were none that did understand, there were none that seek God, they are all gone aside, they are all together become filthy, there is none that doeth good. Listen, the New Testament tells us a little bit more about that in Romans chapter 3. It talks about in chapter 3, starting in verse 9. What then, are we better than they? No, in no wise, for we have proved both Jews and Gentiles that they are all under sin. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understandeth. There is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way. They are altogether become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. And he continues to go on, and he quotes some other passages there. But in Romans chapter 3, we find that the Apostle Paul is reminding us that this chapter is really talking about the fact that there were none good. We're not just talking about the atheists that have said there is no God. There were none good. There were none righteous. There were none that would seek after God. But he came, right? And he redeemed some of us. Again, the idea that it doesn't matter Jew or Gentile. The Bible said there was none good, no, not one. Okay, so just that short reminder about Psalms 14 and Psalms 53, and then I'll leave it at that. I would encourage you, if you don't remember some of those things, go back, YouTube channel about 10 or 11 months ago, and find the title, There Is No God, and take a look at that. Where we're going to be today is Psalm chapter 54, which we will also cover some familiar passages, because we've covered some of what's talked about here in this chapter in Brother Philip's study recently with David and Saul. It's just interesting to me that as we hit both of these chapters, we've kind of touched on both of them here in the last year. Now, Psalms 54 gives us a pretty specific superscription. And it talks about a psalm of David when the Ziphians came and said to Saul, "Doth not David hide himself with us?" Now, that is the superscription that's above this. And I will show you here in a minute where that is, but I want to read the psalm first. Then we'll go talk about where this happened, and then we'll come back and read the psalm one more time. It says in verse 1, "Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength." Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God, and give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them. Selah. Behold, God is mine helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. He shall reward evil unto mine enemies, cut them off in thy truth. I will freely sacrifice unto thee. I will praise thy name, O Lord, for it is good. For he hath delivered me out of all trouble, and mine eye has seen his desire upon mine enemies. So keeping in mind that David has written this psalm based on the time when the Ziphians came and said to Saul, "Doth not David hide himself with us?" Now, Brother Philip covered these passages in 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 23. Now, we're not going to necessarily read all of chapter 23. I'll give you a quick summary of the first half. David comes in here, and he is going to deliver a city that the Philistines are fighting against. And David asks the Lord, "Should I go up and smite the Philistines?" And the Lord told him he should go. And David goes and he fights the Philistines. He saves this city. And the problem is that Saul has found out that David is down in this city. And David asks the Lord, is Saul going to come? And the answer from the Lord is yes, Saul's going to come. And the next question is will the men of this city turn me over to Saul? And the answer to that is yes, they will. Now, how discouraging would that be to be the guy that comes in, saves the city from certain destruction, and then know that when your enemy gets there, they will turn you over. Now, we could talk about whether they had a choice or what would happen, and get it, who Saul is, but the Lord did tell him, they will turn you over. And then David, in verse 13, it says, Then David and his men, which were about 600, arose and departed out of Keilah, and went whithersoever they could go. And it was told Saul that David was escaped from Keilah, and he forbare to go forth. And David abode in the wilderness in strongholds, and remained in a mountain in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day. You see that? Saul sought him every day. Now you talk about something that is consuming Saul. He is seeking David every day, but God delivered him not unto his hand. Now, that's a neat verse. David is being sought every day by the king of the land, but God was on his side, and God did not allow Saul to be able to get him. Now you guys remember, this is pretty recent stuff, right? You guys remember as Brother Philip went through all of the stuff between Saul and David, and all the places he was chased, and the things he had to do, and how he could have taken Saul's life a couple times and he didn't. And you remember things like that. You remember how that Saul actually had people waiting outside of his own daughter's house where David was, right? David's wife. And just, man, the treachery and how angry Saul got when Jonathan, his own son, was questioning him about what has David done wrong. You remember all that stuff, I hope, right? It wasn't that long ago. And all that stuff. How many times was Saul this close? How many people betrayed David? How many times did people like the Ziphians actually say, hey, Saul, he's down here. And yet despite all of that, Saul couldn't touch him. Saul could not get David. He couldn't do it. Put all his might toward it. Had spies all over the place. Had people betraying David left and right. And yet, despite all that, God did not allow Saul to get David. And interestingly enough, it's Jonathan, Saul's own son, who understands why David will not be taken. Now, he's one of the last people you might think would understand why David's not going to be taken. But Jonathan got it. And you'll see that here in a minute. It says in verse 15, And David saw that Saul was come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a wood. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David into the wood and strengthened his hand in God. Now what a friend. You think about that. His father is out to get David, seeking him every day. And yet Jonathan, honestly taking his own life in his hands because of the state of mind that Saul was in, there's no telling what he would have done, he could have done. But Jonathan goes and he finds David. And you gotta love the heart of Jonathan, because why does Jonathan go find David? To strengthen him. And how is he going to strengthen him? He encourages him in the Lord. And that is the way it should be. You think about the people that you know that are down and out right now, the people that may have been betrayed, the people that may have hard things at them, they may be struggling with different things, and you know what a good Christian brother, a good Christian sister, a good Christian friend is going to do? They're going to come along beside them, and listen, are they going to talk to them about the things that they need and try to help them with the things they need? Yes, but in the end, what they need is to be strengthened in the Lord. You know part of how he did that? He reminded David of the promise that God had made. what better way to come along and strengthen somebody, to come along and strengthen a fellow believer, than to remind them through both your words and your actions of what God's promises are. And that's what Jonathan did. It says that he strengthened his hand in God in verse 17. And he said unto him, fear not. Fear not. Jonathan, your dad is seeking my life every day. And it seems like every time I turn around, there's somebody willing to turn me in. But Jonathan says, fear not. For the hand of Saul my father shall not fight thee. He won't. Jonathan utters these words in complete confidence. My father shall not fight thee. And thou shalt be king over Israel. Brother Philip talked about this. David, yes, had already been anointed king. He knew that he was one day to be king. But one thing you get when you study 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, David wasn't fighting to be king. David wasn't trying to take over the kingdom from Saul. He showed repeatedly, when he could have taken Saul's life, he showed repeatedly that his goal was not to just take over the kingdom. He knew he was going to be king, but he wanted to do it in God's time and in God's way. But man, how discouraging it had to be on the run all the time, to be being betrayed, to have to be hiding out in the woods and hide your family away from people and all the stuff he's going through. And yet Jonathan comes along and says, hey, I know God will make you king. You will be king one day. Now we know that Jonathan isn't able to do what he says next, but it shows the heart of Jonathan. And it shows just how much he believed what he was saying. Because he not only did he tell him that his father wouldn't find him and that he would be the king over Israel, he said, I shall be next unto thee, and that also Saul my father knoweth. Jonathan is saying, listen, you will be king one day. My father won't find you, and you will be king. And David, when that happens, I will be there supporting you, and I will be by your side, and my father knows I'm okay with that. My father knows this. I think it's not only saying that Saul knows that Jonathan's going to be by his side. I think that is implied there. But I think in the end, Jonathan knows that part of why Saul hates David so much is because Saul knows David is going to be king. These are the words that Jonathan encouraged David with. And again, I think the important thing is to remember, he strengthened him in God by reminding him of the promise that God had made. And Jonathan, who should have been the rightful heir next in line, said, listen, I believe this so much. I want you to know that when God makes you king, I will be right there by your side. It says in verse 18, and they too made a covenant before the Lord, and David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went to his house. Now David has just been strengthened by Jonathan, reminded of the promises of God, reminding that Saul would not find him, and he would be king one day. And then you run into verse 19. Because where is David at? David is in the wilderness of Ziph, in a mountain in Ziph. It says in verse 19, then came up the Ziphites to Saul to Gibeah, saying, doth not David hide himself with us in strongholds in the wood, in the hill of Hakal, which is on the south of Jeshurun? So, what was our superscription to Psalms chapter 54? A Psalm of David, when the Ziphians came and said to Saul, doth not David hide himself with us? You just saw that happen in 1 Samuel chapter 23, verse 19. The Ziphites came to Saul. Hey, listen, they went out of their way to go get Saul, saying, doth not David hide himself with us in strongholds in the wood? He is over here, Saul. It says in verse 20, now therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of thy soul to come down, and our part shall be to deliver him unto the king's hands. They are saying, listen, he's down here in our neck of the woods. We generally know where he is, and you can come on down to your heart's desire, and our goal is we are going to deliver him to you. That's what we're going to do for you, Saul. Verse 21, and Saul said, blessed be ye of the Lord, for ye have compassion on me. I flagged this verse when Brother Philip was going through this, and if you look at this, the Bible app that I have on my phone, it is highlighted with a note. And it says, listen, just because someone invokes the name of the Lord doesn't really mean that the Lord is with them. Doesn't really mean that what this person says is true. Saul has already been forsaken by God, and his defeat after defeat after defeat is showing that. And his attitude, his anger, his bitterness. I mean, this is a man that God has withdrawn from. And yet Saul somehow still feels it's appropriate to invoke the name of the Lord and call down a blessing upon somebody. By the way, he's calling down a blessing upon somebody that is doing stuff against the will of the Lord. Man, they're going against the guy that God has said should be the next king. And here Saul is, by the way, according to Jonathan, Saul really knows what's supposed to happen. He knows that David is in line for the throne, and he knows that Jonathan is going to be there with him. And yet here he's calling down a blessing from the Lord upon these people that have just betrayed David. Not everybody that calls out the name of the Lord is actually in the Lord's favor. But he says, blessed be ye of the Lord, for ye have compassion on me. Go, I pray you, prepare yet, and know and see his place, wherein his haunt is, and who has seen him there, for it is told me that he dealeth very subtly. He sends them back. He says, now you go do some spying. You go do some searching. You find him, because David's a tricky little guy. And I want to make sure we've got him in hand when I get there. Verse 23. See therefore, and take knowledge of all the lurking places where he hideth himself, and come ye again to me with certainty, and I will go with you. And it shall come to pass, if he be in the land, that I will search him out throughout all the thousands of Judah. And you go do some spying, you go do some looking, you come back with some intel for me, and I will go with you when you've got it figured out, and we will hunt him down. In verse 24, and they arose and went to Ziph before Saul. But David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the plain on the south of Jeshimon. Saul also and his men went to seek him, and they told David, wherefore he came down into a rock and abode in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. And Saul went on the side of the mountain, on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul, for Saul and his men compassed David, and his men round about to take him. You need to get this picture in your mind. David's been hiding. The Ziphites have betrayed him. They've done some lurking, some spying. Saul's coming down. They know where David is. Saul and his men come in. And as it turns out, Saul's on one side of the mountain. David and his men are on the other side of the mountain. Saul's men are starting to compass. Right? They're compassing this area. You know what happens when they successfully do that? They got David trapped. And David is afraid. It says in verse 27, "But there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, Haste thee and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David, and went against the Philistines." What did Jonathan say? "My father Saul will not find you, and you will be king someday." Now, I don't know if the words of Jonathan were echoing in David's ears as Saul's men were on one side of the mountain and David was on the other, and Saul's men start to compass the mountainside. I wonder if David was thinking, man, Jonathan might have been wrong. I don't know. But you know what happened? Right on time, messengers came and told Saul, the Philistines are attacking, and you gotta come. Saul had a choice. He could keep trying to compass around and surround David and take him and lose his kingdom to the Philistines, or he could go fight the Philistines and give up on David for a minute. And he went back and he tried to fight the Philistines. God used that to free David. You know what he's doing time and time again with David? He is showing David, I'm in control. Even when it seems hopeless, even when it seems the enemies are going to overflow you, even when it seems like, how can I fulfill my promise of making you king one day? When it seems like that's just not going to happen, God says, nope, I'm in control. This is going to happen the way I want it to happen. And he delivers David. It's no coincidence. Listen, it is no coincidence that the Philistines happen to be attacking at this time. This is the hand of God. This is the hand of God. It says in verse 29, "And David went up from thence and dwelt in strongholds at En-gedi." So, in this chapter of Psalms chapter 23, you see that David's been on the run. Saul is seeking him every day. Jonathan finds him, and Jonathan strengthens him in the Lord. Reminds him of the promises of God, encourages him that, listen, God has said you will be king. And because God has said you will be king, I know my father won't find you. David is then betrayed by strangers, by the people of Ziph. He's betrayed. They turn him over to Saul, spy on him. Saul comes to find him. He's right there at his neck. Man, he's close. And then God intervenes, and Saul has to flee from David's pursuit, and in turn, go back to protect the country from Philistines. That's the deliverance of God. That's what David is writing about when he wrote Psalms chapter 54. When he was betrayed by the people of Ziph, who went and told Saul where he was, it was that event that led to the writing of Psalms chapter 54. And so as we go back there, let's read that again. Psalms chapter 54. "Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength." You think that's an appropriate prayer under the situation that David was in? It's pretty fitting that when the Ziphites betrayed him and Saul is encompassing around about him, it's very fitting that the first words out of his mouth would be, "Save me, O God. Save me, O God, by thy name, by thy authority, by thy power, and judge me by thy strength." Again, we think of judge being a negative thing. It's not always a negative thing. Judge me by thy strength. Lord, You pass verdict on this situation, and you deliver me from this. David knew he was innocent, and he is throwing himself before the Lord. He says in verse 2, hear my prayer, O God. You want to know? I'm going to tell you something. You ever wonder what David was doing in the times when he was being pursued by Saul? He told you. He was praying. He told you. When did he write this? When the Ziph turned him over to Saul. And he said, oh, hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to the words of my mouth. And then the next thing he says is he starts to describe the problem that he's faced with. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them. Selah. How fitting is that verse for the story that we just read? What was Saul doing every day? He was seeking David every day. I would call that oppressed. How did Saul know where David was? Well, because a group of strangers betrayed him. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. Whether or not he knew the people of Ziph or not, listen, they were acting like strangers. They were acting like foreigners. They had taken a guy that had done no harm to them. Matter of fact, I read in one commentary, when you study the life of David in this time when he was on the run, you see multiple instances where he did his best to actually try to protect the people around where he was. And yet, what did they do? They turned him over. And his prayer to God was to literally take what happened and bring that to God. He literally stated it. Strangers have risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them. How can he say they have not set God before them? What was the promise of God to David? God had anointed David to be the next king. And even though David knew his time wasn't yet, to seek after David's life to destroy him, considering the fact that Saul really knew David was to be the next king, according to Jonathan, right? To try to destroy David is to do what? To actually go against God. That's what he was doing. And David here, in his prayer to God, literally lifts those things up to God and says, strangers have betrayed me. There's those that are oppressing me. And I know they are going against you, God. They have not set you in their path. They are not doing these things. They're doing these things because they're not following after you. Verse 4, after his moment of pause, he says this, behold, God is mine helper. He knows where his strength comes from. He knows who can deliver him and who will deliver him. And what did we talk about when we read what happened when Saul caught up to David? Who was David's helper? God was, right? Because just at the right moment, right before David's going to be overrun, word comes to Saul that the Philistines have attacked him. He's got to leave. God is mine helper. And then in verse 4, I really wonder if he wasn't thinking back to the words of Jonathan at this point, when he says, the Lord is with them that uphold my soul. How did the book of 1 Samuel chapter 23 describe what Jonathan did? It says that he strengthened his hand in God. And then he reminded David of God's promise. And in the very psalm written about this instance, David says, the Lord is with them that uphold my soul. I wonder, I don't know this, but I wonder if he was thinking back to Jonathan at that time, remembering that right before all of this transpired, Jonathan had encouraged him and strengthened him. He says in verse 5, he shall reward evil unto mine enemies, cut them off in thy truth. Now, I don't know what happened to the Ziphites. I don't. I tried to do a little bit of digging. I haven't done a ton. I tried to do a little bit. I don't know. I wasn't quickly able to find anything. But I do know what happened to Saul. I do know what happened to him and how his house was cut off. The Lord will return evil to those that are contrary to his will and his way. The enemies will be rewarded for their deeds. And Saul and his house was cut off. In verse 6, I will freely sacrifice unto thee. I will praise thy name, O Lord, for it is good. Now, if David wrote this right after these events, he was still on the run. But with confidence, he says, I will freely sacrifice unto thee. Now, whether David was thinking about the time when he would be free and would not be under pursuit anymore and could freely go to the tabernacle and do the things that needed to be done, or whether he is just talking about the sacrifices of thanksgiving and praise and gratitude that he can offer, even while he's on the run, I don't know. But you do see that David here, when he's faced with what the Lord can do, with confidence, he says, the evil will be rewarded for their deeds, and I will continue to sacrifice to you, and I will continue to offer up praise unto your name. So that is good. That is right. That is what should be done. And Lord, despite everything that's went on, despite that there's people that are out there trying to oppress me, despite the fact that there's people that have betrayed me, I am going to continue to praise and glorify your name. Verse 7, for he hath delivered me out of all trouble, and mine eye has seen his desire upon mine enemies. David says, you want to know why I can praise God? You want to know why I'm going to continue to praise him? Do you want to know why I'm going to offer up my sacrifices to him? Because I have seen his deliverance. He's delivered me out of trouble. I've seen it. I've seen what he does to those that were trying to oppress me. He has delivered me out of all trouble, and mine eye has seen his desire upon mine enemies. What happened back there in 1 Samuel chapter 23? When it seemed impossible, when it seemed at its most dire moment, when it probably seemed like there was no way out, God stepped in and delivered David. He didn't just deliver David, but he sent Saul off to fight battle. He sent Saul off because the enemy was coming in. Which you might could argue, maybe that was part of the judgment that was coming. He had to leave because he was being attacked. David recounts very well in this psalm, in a very short summary, the concepts behind what happened in 1 Samuel chapter 23. He was under oppression. He was betrayed. And Yet the first thing he did was to go to the Lord and say, save me, O Lord. Save me, O God. Hear my prayer. And he took that challenge, that problem that he had, he took it to God. And then he saw God deliver him from those things. And his reaction to that deliverance was just more, a deeper desire to praise God. And we need this. We need this. When you're faced with something, take it to the Lord. Lay it at his feet. And you don't have to shroud it in anything. You don't have to kind of hide it. You don't have to just give this generic statements that don't really mean anything. Listen, God knows what's going on. When you go before him, alone, in your closet, praying to him, listen, you could just name it. You can just lay it out. I think that's what he did. He laid out the scenario that he was in before God. And when you see God move, you give him the glory, you give him the honor, and you praise and magnify his name. Such a great example. Such a great example. All right, we're going to go ahead and end there. I hope it's been an encouragement to you. I know, hopefully, most of this stuff was pretty familiar since we just went through it not that long ago. But it is so neat to me how well Psalm 54 fits so perfectly into what you saw there in 1 Samuel chapter 23. All right, Brother Phil, would you come and lead us in a song, please?